You've got one chance to explain to me how this happened, what pushed you to that limit.
Alan Hruby was a spoiled teenager obsessed with money who had access to the deep pockets of his wealthy family. His parents were John and Tinker Hruby, a perfect couple who lived a comfortable and fulfilling life in their hometown of Duncan, Oklahoma, where they owned the local newspaper. John's family owned the Duncan Banner for 3 generations before selling it in 1997. After the sale, they acquired the Marlow Review in 2007 and then bought the Comanche County Chronicle in 2013. Along with their 2 children, Catherine and Alan, the Hruby family has prospered through a successful newspaper business. Catherine, their daughter, was born on August 21, 1997. She was described as bright, vertically gifted, naturally talented, and very hardworking. These traits were well manifested in her studies and sports. By the age of 17, while in high school, she was the star of the volleyball team. She also excelled in her social life, had many close friends, and was often the person with whom people around her felt the most close. Catherine was admired by everyone who knew her. Catherine's older brother, Alan, was born on May 8, 1995. At the time of this story, he was 18 years old and a freshman at the University of Oklahoma. Despite his friendliness and sociability, something about him seemed quite different from his sister. At first glance, it was obvious to all the students around him that he came from a wealthy family, or at least wanted to appear so. And while Catherine was a rather modest person, Alan was quite the opposite. Alan was described as extravagant. His friends and classmates called him preppy, and some even said he was rich and spoiled. Over time, what was initially harmless eventually took a toll on the family's finances. With their business slowly beginning to decline, Alan's parents were concerned. By 2014, as Alan was preparing to enter university, print media was gradually becoming obsolete due to modern technology. By that time, the digital media industry, and the internet in particular, was growing at an ever-increasing rate. Meanwhile, newspaper companies were beginning to decline. So, as Alan's spending habits increased, his parents began to notice the real impact he was having on their finances. At first, they took the hit and started cutting back on their own spending. However, as their son showed no signs of slowing down, they eventually came to the very difficult conclusion that Alan needed to be cut off from their finances. It's important to emphasize that at the time of this decision, Alan's habit had progressed significantly. It was no longer a so-called bad habit. Instead, he had become a full-fledged shopaholic. So what do you think people with addictions do when they are cut off from the source? Sometimes they use any means necessary to get it back. With no funds in his own bank account and cut off from family money, Alan began to become desperate. To get by, he looked for weaknesses in the people around him. And unfortunately, his grandmother became an obvious choice. Although it is unclear how exactly Alan managed to deceive her, it is known that he managed to steal the numbers and everything he needed from her credit card and was able to use it at his discretion. And, of course, the first thing he did after that was to travel. With his grandmother's credit card in hand, Alan flew to one of his favorite places, Paris. And while there, he took pictures of himself and his expensive adventures. When Alan had finally traveled enough in France at his grandmother's expense, he finally returned home, although his family did not greet him as he expected. Instead, the police were waiting for him. Alan's father, John, decided that he had had enough. He could have tolerated his son's behavior if it was just him. But his latest stunt, using stolen money from his grandmother, was completely unacceptable. So, after spending more than $5,000 of the stolen money, Alan Hruby was arrested on felony charges. What may not come as a surprise, however, is that despite this display of force against him, he ultimately got off scot-free. Instead of going to jail, Alan managed to get off with a suspended sentence and a mandatory course of substance abuse counseling. You would have thought that after he squandered his grandmother's money and had legal action taken against him, Alan would have learned something about his toxic behavior and maybe even made an effort to do something about it. But unfortunately, in the end, nothing changed about Alan except his attitude. From a pampered and happy man, he turned into nothing more than a spoiled brat. And his anger at being deprived of his money was actually growing every day. And what was disturbing was that this was not the only source of negativity that was growing in his life. During these difficulties, he is known to have turned to not-so-reputable people for help to finance his addiction. And by the time this joyful trip through Europe was over and his access to money was cut off, he owed thousands of dollars to local loan sharks. With nothing to pay them back, the pressure was on, and unable to spend or pay back the money he did have, Alan was desperate. His comfortable and cozy world was crumbling right before his eyes, and because of all this financial anxiety, Alan felt that something had to be done. Alan felt that he was being pushed beyond the limits of reason, and he felt that something had to be done to free himself from these new living conditions. So what would you have done in Alan's situation? Because for him, the answer was obvious. He needed to hit the jackpot in a big way, and the best way to do that was through life insurance. But the problem is, with healthy parents, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So to reiterate, Alan was so obsessed with trivial expenses that he was ready to kill his entire family to get his inheritance. I mean, the ship had already sailed on that, but to make matters worse, he wasn't willing to share it with his sister. He felt that his family had betrayed him, and this was the only way to make things right. And tragically, all of this would culminate in October 2014. October 9th, 2014, was a typical Monday when Alan walked out of his house and opened the door to his father's truck. His mother and sister were at home, and his father was gone for a short time, which fit perfectly into his plan. Alan opened the car door and took out his father's 9mm pistol before locking the truck again and getting inside. And with the gun firmly in his hand, he was adamant about his plans. For the first time since he had been cut off from the family money, he felt like he was finally back in control. And when he entered the family home, he saw his first victim across the room, his own mother. Tinker was sitting at the dining room table at the time. She never heard Alan approach her from behind, and it is unlikely that she ever realized that Alan shot and killed her in cold blood. After firing the first shot, Tinker fell to the floor before Alan fired a second shot at his mother. His sister was outside the house at the time, but when she heard the noise, she ran inside to see what was happening. As she turned the corner, she was confronted by her own brother, who was pointing a gun at her. Alan fired a third shot, and just like that, she was killed too. Alan sat next to his mother and sister for more than an hour, patiently waiting for his father to come home. And unfortunately, when he entered the house, John also faced brutal treachery. He was shot twice, and the second bullet killed him. Now that his family's fate was sealed, Alan took the security system's hard drive. Together with the murder weapon, he fled the crime scene with both in hand, leaving a once beautiful family in his violent wake. 4 days later, at around 9 a.m. on October 13th, police received a chilling phone call from the housekeeper. Several officers would actually suffer post-traumatic stress disorder from the crime scene, as the house was covered in blood. But that wasn't the only thing that confused them. The family's state-of-the-art surveillance system, installed throughout the property, seemed to have no backup drive, and its footage was nowhere to be seen. It quickly became apparent to the detectives that they needed to find Alan, and fortunately it took only 2 days to track him down. Alan was initially detained on charges unrelated to the murder. That is, he still violated his parole by crossing state lines. Police also investigated other potential charges, including fraud. He had applied for another credit card in his grandmother's name and had written checks in his name for more than $17,000. The police couldn't believe how low Alan was willing to go to finance his expensive addiction, but they did not know that things were about to get much worse. When Alan was already in custody, he was properly informed about what had happened to his family. This was an important moment for the investigators. Alan's reaction would make it clear how involved he was, and to be honest, he put on a good show. Sobbing and crying loudly, he put on a mask of shock and grief. But the officers watching him seemed to think his reaction came from a different source of sadness. In fact, it seemed that Alan was not really mourning the loss of his parents. Instead, he was mourning the loss of money and reputation. The police quickly assumed that Alan was at least somewhat involved in the murder of his family, and it didn't take long to get a confession out of him. He realized very early on that the game was up, and that deception would only lead to a longer trial. To the detective's surprise, Alan confessed that he had been planning the murder for quite some time, and believed that he had taken all the proper precautions to avoid being caught red-handed. He even left his cell phone in his campus room to confuse the police on that fateful Monday morning. Ultimately, though, his parole violation rendered this plan futile. Police also learned that Alan had in fact told his friends about his family's murder, although, understandably, no one took him seriously at the time. Allegedly, even his sister heard about what he said, but she didn't realize that Alan was serious either. But eventually, after minimal pressure, Alan broke down and told the police his whole story, that the grand plan was to become the sole heir to his family and that he owed thousands and thousands of dollars to loan sharks. In the end, the brutal threats of these loan sharks apparently pushed him over the edge, or so Alan would have us believe. When the police asked him where the murder weapon was, Alan claimed that he had thrown it into the lake near the house. However, divers eventually returned empty-handed. But after digging deeper into Alan's life, detectives found a storage unit rented by his grandmother that Alan had been using on the sly, and after breaking into it, they found both the gun and the missing hard drive of the home security system, giving them all the evidence they needed to bring him down. Officers were also able to find security footage for the storage unit itself, which ultimately showed his Jeep in the parking lot on the day of the murder. Moving on to the trial, the police had more than enough to crush him before the trial began. That is, they not only had a wealth of evidence against him, but also Alan's own confession. Before the trial began, local and national media learned of his crimes and further speculated that the death penalty might be an option. And the district attorney, who was actually a close friend of the family, made it clear that the death penalty was a possibility. With such huge potential consequences, Alan voluntarily pleaded guilty to the crimes in exchange for 3 life sentences. And as part of this plea agreement, he waived his right to any future appeals. This decision was made to prevent the death penalty, and ultimately, his surviving relatives were satisfied with this outcome. It is worth noting that death penalty trials are often very lengthy and can last for decades before a defendant is executed. Alan's family wanted to avoid the inevitable media circus that accompanies a lengthy death penalty case. As part of his sentence, Alan is now prohibited from contacting his family in any form, and for the most part, they seem to be quite okay with this. 2 of Alan's relatives have written to the district attorney expressing on behalf of the family what they think of Alan and his punishment. Tinker's father said, "We feel that if Alan is sentenced to death, I will go to my grave without seeing justice done. If he is sentenced to life without parole, I may be able to rest in peace." John's sister continues, "If the murderer fully admits his guilt and evil deeds before the court by pleading guilty, I will accept that there will be no trial, and that he will be sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without parole. He must remain in prison for the rest of his life." Another aspect of the plea deal was that Alan had to tell what exactly happened on the day he killed his family. Looking pained and exhausted, Alan slowly approached the judge. He then turned to the crowd and painfully described the events leading up to the murder in a voice that trembled with tears, visibly shaking. As for the housekeeper, who unfortunately stumbled upon the crime scene, she later described the trauma she had experienced when she saw her longtime clients dead in front of her. The community itself was also experiencing trauma and grief, and many people who knew the family and were close to them were completely devastated. I know it's a cliché, but no one expected this to happen in a small town like Duncan, especially by a family member they knew. Alan's horrific actions shocked the town, and it's clear how much the community absolutely loved the Hruby family. John and Tinker were generous and successful not only in their professional careers, but also in their personal lives. They did their best to take care of their family and the people around them, and they were very much loved for it. Their daughter Catherine was a shining example of all the good they were, and with her bright and kind head on her shoulders, she had a very successful future ahead of her. And it was all tragically cut short because of her disgusting brother. They never expected one of the people closest to them to be capable of such great evil. And in the end, it was their generosity that was taken advantage of and became a factor in their murder. The town of Duncan recognized the impact that the Hruby family had on the community, and they eventually honored their good lives by inducting John and Tinker into the Journalism Hall of Fame. Many people still find it hard to believe that the guy they once thought was an innocent college student, albeit a money-obsessed, narcissistic bastard, had the potential to kill his own flesh and blood. After all it took was financial stress to turn a narcissistic son into a family killer. And that's how Alan Hruby strangled the lives of everyone who was closest to him. Today he sits alone in a prison cell, unable to contact anyone from his life before prison. And without a cell phone, he can't even brag about his meals behind bars. It's a really sad story if you ask me, because all these deaths were completely unnecessary. Alan's family loved him, and maybe they gave him too much. And when they had to cut back, he repaid their favor by killing them.